Hello everyone, this is Ted Bauman here, editor of the Bauman Letter with your weekly Friday video. Today I'm going to be talking about something that I used to write about a lot, and that is the role of asset protection, trusts, things like that. And I'm doing that because they've been in the news lately. There's been a big release of documents, kind of like what happened a while back with the Panama Papers. This one's a lot bigger. It's called the Pandora Papers, because after opening the box, all these evils have spread out into the world. But let's talk first about something that you probably have thought about, but probably don't know the background to. You ever noticed that no matter how low the interest rate goes, the interest rate on your credit card never seems to fall, that it tends to be in the double digits no matter how low interest rates are? Well, here's a chart that shows the spread between the average commercial bank interest rate on credit card balances versus the effective federal funds rate. Basically, these guys are able to charge close to 15% on average to most people, even though they're paying practically nothing for that money. You know why that's the case? South Dakota. There's Mount Rushmore. Never been to the state, plan to visit. I hear it's beautiful, but that's certainly its defining feature, at least visibly. One of South Dakota's invisible defining features is that it really created the modern credit card industry. In the 1970s, you see, banks in the United States were in big trouble. You probably understand that there was a lot of inflation in the 70s, and the Federal Reserve chairman at the time decided enough is enough. So he raised interest rates through the roof into double digits for the first time in decades. And that led to a pullback in inflation, but it also meant that banks that had credit card accounts on their books, that had credit card customers, were losing money. That's because the banks had to pay the market rate for the money that they used to fund their customers' credit card purchases. But most of the United States had what were called anti-usury laws. They'd been in place since the Great Depression. Those were laws that essentially limited the amount of interest that you could charge to a client or a customer at the state level. In other words, every state had anti-usury laws that limited how much interest they could charge. So in 1981, Citibank went to South Dakota and said to the governor, I'll tell you what, we'll create 400 jobs here in Sioux Falls, the capital, if you abolish your usury law. And you know what? He did it in one day. A 14-word law basically abolished usury interest caps in South Dakota. And that is why today practically every major bank headquarters its credit card business in Sioux Falls. It's also the reason why credit card debt took off after 1980. Here's a chart, and is now over $1 trillion. Revolving credit, in other words, the amount of money that is in credit card and other revolving accounts by the beginning of 2019 was over $1 trillion, and it remains that way today. But South Dakota has another role, and that relates to the so-called Pandora Papers. It has made the United States the #1 place to hide your money around the world, at least #2 after the Cayman Islands. Kudos if you can figure out where the Cayman Islands are. Here's a chart that shows the top 15 countries in terms of financial secrecy. That's the FSI as the Financial Secrecy Index. And over the right-hand side is the country's global weight in terms of how important that particular country is to allowing people around the world to hide their money, hide their assets from whatever, whether it's from the tax persons, the tax authorities in their home countries, or from spouses trying to get alimony, or from business partners trying to collect money that they were swindled out of, whatever it is. The United States has an over 20% market share in that particular business, bigger than anybody else in the world. Now, how did that happen? Well, it goes back to South Dakota. The Chief Justice of South Dakota Supreme Court once said to the legislature that while a lot of people like to fly over South Dakota, it's a flyover state, they somehow find a way to leave their dollars right here. And that's why South Dakota has become one of the most important jurisdictions, not just in the United States, but on the entire planet for hiding your money. Understanding why means understanding something called a trust. Now, trusts have been around since Roman times. They're essentially a legal structure that allows property to be held for the benefit of another person's use. Now, the advantage of that is pretty straightforward. Let me give you the example. If you own a rental property. If you own a rental property in your own name and somebody falls, breaks their leg in that rental property and it's personally owned by you, you can be sued by them. But if you create a limited liability company and place your rental property within that, then the person who breaks their leg can only sue the LLC. And the only asset the LLC has is the house. So your other assets as an individual are not at risk. It ring fences that risk. So that's, in a sense, part of what a trust does. It allows you to separate yourself from your assets. Now, traditionally, trusts have a beneficiary. The beneficiary can be your children, it can be your spouse. In modern times, it can even be yourself. But the bottom line is that when something is in trust, it's legally separate from you as an individual, and all that property becomes separate from anything that can happen to you personally, legally. Now, before the 16th century in England, trusts were what were called perpetual trusts. They existed in perpetuity. That means that they could continue to hold whatever assets had been entrusted to them forever. So if an English noble person, an aristocrat, decided to put their lands and their houses and all the things that generated income for them, particularly agricultural property, then no matter what happened to them or their children or whatever, that money would be safe. And it could be protected from things like legal cases, divorce, being, all kinds of things that could lead that money to get out. But also it could prevent the heirs of an aristocrat from spending that money and thereby keeping it in the family and allowing it to grow so that the family could have money basically forever. It could remain rich long after the time when that money was actually originally earned. So that seemed good from if you were in the perspective of a British aristocrat. Just to give you an example of how that would work in today's economy. If you put $1 million into a perpetual trust today and it grew tax-free at an average annual rate of 6%, in 200 years it would be worth $136 billion. Just 100 years later, thanks to compounding, it would be worth twice the size of the U.S. economy as it is today. So as you can see, with that kind of long-term potential to increase and concentrate wealth, eventually British politicians started to get worried, including the British Crown, because the king at the time thought, well, this could actually mean that some of these aristocrats could be more powerful than me. And so I got to do something about it. So what they did is they started to put pressure on judges to disallow these kinds of perpetual trust. And in the 17th century, the British Parliament passed a rule against perpetual trust. Trusts had to end after 100 years. So that means, sure, you can put money into trust to benefit your kids, but after a couple of generations of your kids, that money has to come out of the trust and it has to be either spent or used for something. And at that point, it gets pumped back into the economy. It's not just one family's wealth. It gets used for things, and it also gets to pay taxes on whatever those things are. Now, if I say something like it was that money then became subject to taxation, you may say, well, that's precisely why these trusts are a good thing. But here's the thing. Economic historians are pretty much united in the belief that the abolition of perpetual trusts in Great Britain was one of the key things that made Great Britain one of the world's economic powerhouses really up until the mid-19th or mid-20th century, because instead of allowing wealth to be concentrated in the hands of a small group of families who could essentially keep it out of circulation and for their own use, and not buying goods, not stimulating economic activity, abolishing perpetual trust meant that that money did get out of the economy, and it helped to turbocharge the British economy. So one of the key things about trust is it's not just about what's good for the individual who holds the trust. British history shows that it has a big role to play in the economic dynamism of the country itself. Now, British immigrants to North America, the people who came to populate what's now the United States and Canada, brought this version of a trust with them. And that idea of a non-perpetual trust, one that had to end at some point, lasted until 1983, when Governor Wild Bill Yankov of South Dakota agreed to abolish the rule against perpetual trusts. They wrote a law, very short. It said there will be no limit on the lifetime of trusts in South Dakota. Ever since then, South Dakota has become one of the world's leading destinations for perpetual trust, people who want to put their money in perpetual trust. Now, here are some of the features of a South Dakota trust. One of them is that unlike most jurisdictions, in South Dakota, you don't have to have a separate beneficiary. You don't have to have your kids or whatever. You can make yourself the beneficiary of your own trust. It's called a grantor trust. And that means that, for example, if you're a Chinese business person who's worried that the Chinese government is going to, crack down on you and try to confiscate your property, maybe you would then go and buy property or businesses in the United States or Canada, maybe Vancouver, where a lot of Chinese have their homes. And then you'll put them all into the control of the South Dakota Grantor Trust. And that means that in the United States and in Canada, nobody, including the Chinese government, can get those things as a result of any legal action. They're protected. And that's the same for anybody on the planet who wants to park their money in a trust company in Sioux Falls. Now, also under South Dakota law, after 2 years after the trust is founded, it becomes anything in the trust is completely immune from any claims by any creditors, including ex-spouses, creditors, business partners, tax authorities, whoever it may be. Now, you may say, okay, well, there's that 2-year window period. But the key thing is that what people often do is, that if they know that at some point in the future, they may be faced with some kind of a situation. Let's say a guy is thinking he's jolling it. We're not jolling. That's a South African term. He's messing around behind his wife's back. He thinks he might someday be in trouble for that. Long before she finds out or even they divorce, he'll set up a South Dakota trust to protect his stuff. And by that point, it's maybe a 5-year-old trust, so she can't get anything out of it because the law in South Dakota makes that impossible. Now, the third thing is that all of the court documents and other records related to the formation of South Dakota trusts are completely private and they remain secret forever. So you cannot find out who owns a trust. You cannot find out who the who the beneficiaries are, who gets the benefit. You can't even find out what's in the trust. It's all completely secret. That's even better from the perspective of financial privacy than most of the world's jurisdictions. The only one that is more secret is the Cayman Islands, and that's simply because even though South Dakota law is favorable towards trusts, it still has to comply with some United States federal regulations and banking regulations. So if we could magically get away with the IRS, for example, that'd probably put South Dakota on the top. The last thing, and probably the one that makes it just as attractive as anything else, is that South Dakota has no income tax, no inheritance tax, and no capital gains tax. So if you put your assets inside a South Dakota trust and let them grow at the rate of the rest of the economy, then all things being equal, you're going to end up with a much bigger pile of wealth at the end of the day than if you keep your money elsewhere, simply because you're not paying any tax on it. So if you own shares in the stock market, for example, in a South Dakota trust, no matter how long you keep them, no matter what goes on, as long as they're inside the trust, they grow tax-free. And the money that is liquidated, in other words, when the when say the trustee sells shares and disperses some of that money, yes, they'll pay capital gains tax to the federal government, but not to the South Dakota government. So all of the things being equal, it's a great place to hide your money. Now, to give you an idea how good this has been for South Dakota, 10 years ago, the South Dakota trust industry held a little over $57 billion in assets. By the end of 2020, that total was over 10 times. So it's grown to over $570 billion in the last decade. Now, this illustrates really what the fundamental problem is here. And this is, again, this is something that is a little more abstract than what I normally talk about, but it's an important thing to think about because I think, we're buffered about, some people, you're going to see news that say, oh, well, this is great. This is invading financial privacy. What a person has of their own, should be their own. They can do with it what they like. Well, sure, maybe. But at the end of the day, there's also the counter argument that as the British understood back in the 17th century, it also ends up creating these untouchable pools of wealth that can be just essentially pissed away, as they say in Britain, without any benefit to the rest of society, despite the fact that society helped those people make that wealth. So here's an example. You may recall a person by the name of Leona Helmsley. She was a legendarily horrible person. She was the heiress to a New York hotel fortune, never did anything practical as far as I know in her entire life, but inherited a lot of money. And one of her great quotes was this one. She said, "Only the little people pay taxes." She said that during, I'm not quite sure the context, but I know that it had something to do with her being sued for not paying taxes. Now, when she died in 2007, she left $12 million in trust for the care of that little dog you just saw, a Maltese called Trouble. That meant that Trouble dined on crab cakes and Kobe beef. The trust provided $8,000 a year for grooming and $100,000 for security guards for Little Trouble, protecting her against kidnappings as well as reprisals from people that she bit, because apparently she was a nasty little piece of work like her owner. So anyway, so when New York State judges began to question whether this was an appropriate use of New York trust law, Helmsley's lawyers simply moved Trouble's trust to South Dakota. Of course, Trouble is long gone. I'm not sure what the provisions are for the money that's in there, but it's basically sitting there and it is inaccessible. It's not doing anything to the economy. Now, of course, other states have caught up with South Dakota. You got Alaska, Nevada, which I've written about, and Delaware also offer perpetual trusts. And all of this, the fact that the United States at the state level has adopted something that medieval countries in Europe realized was a bad idea hundreds of years ago, that has made the United States a global hypocrite. Now, to see why, remember that after the great financial crisis, one of the things that people were really upset about was the fact that the very wealthy seemed to get off scot-free, while a lot of us lost our homes and our fortunes. So Congress passed a law called the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act. It's one that I have to comply with because being a U.S. citizen, dual citizen of South Africa, I have assets in South Africa, and I have to report those under FATCA. The law basically imposes savage penalties on foreign banks that fail to report the financial assets of U.S. taxpayers outside the United States. The law is so powerful that after it was enacted, almost all foreign tax havens stopped serving U.S. customers. For example, in Switzerland, which was traditionally the world's biggest tax haven, Credit Suisse lost 85% of its American customers in the year after the act was enacted. Now, since FATCA applied to everybody outside the United States, the rest of the world decided, well, let's just use the opportunity to create what we'll call a common reporting standard, or CRS. Now, under CRS, all countries agree to exchange information on the assets and financial assets that other citizens keep in each other's banks. So, for example, if you are let's just pick one out of a hat, you're an Argentine person with wealth, and you keep some of that wealth in a trust account in Hong Kong, for example. Whatever the case is, that Hong Kong bank has got to report to the Argentine authorities that you are the beneficiary of a Hong Kong trust valued a certain amount of money. If everything's above board and you're paying your taxes and you're complying with Argentine law, everything's fine. If you're not, the Argentine authorities can find out that way. Now, whether you like that or not, that's the way everybody except the United States operates. And why? Because the United States refused to join CRS. So basically, we now have a situation where through FATCA, the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, the U.S. can force the rest of the world to report on us, U.S. taxpayers, everywhere in the world, but foreign countries cannot get the United States to track their own taxpayers inside the United States. And that's because the United States has this unique situation where these things are decided at state level, not at national level. And that is what has made the United States, by size, the single most important tax haven in the world. So when you hear people, trash talking places like Panama or the Cayman Islands or Guernsey or all these other places, remember, right here in the United States, that's where all kinds of people, some legitimate, but a lot of them not, criminals, dictators, all kinds of nasty people, keep money that they have got through whatever means in trusts in South Dakota because it's good for the economy of South Dakota. That's the only reason. That's why they initially did it, and that's why they keep it. And one of the reasons they keep it is because right now, after all these years of having done this since the early 80s, for all intents and purposes, the trust industry in South Dakota controls the state legislature. I read a little bit about this, and if you ever want to see an example of how the power of money corrupts politics and goes against the interests of individual voters, South Dakota is a case in point. Now, for anybody out there who lives in South Dakota, if you want to trash me in the comments, go right ahead. But I do think it's an interesting idea that we should be aware of, that for all the things that we believe make the world an unfair place and a non-level playing field, one of them is a set of laws enacted and practiced way out there in Sioux Falls. Anyway, that's my message for you today. I'll be back again next week. We'll talk then.